All right, y'all. Welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And I have to go ahead and prep y'all. Dr. Lisa and I are rolling out of meetings into the podcast. So if we're a little extra fired up because we're doing the work and we're about to talk about the work, then so be it. But how are you doing, Dr. Lisa?
I am doing well. So my weekly weather update, we did have a massive dumping of snow in Denver, Colorado and the surrounding area, and I got over 2 feet. So still digging myself out of that, although much of it has melted. But Shauna was very kind to tell me that while I was buried in snow, she was sunning herself in 75-degree weather.
Well,
But the
I
tables
feel
have
bad.
turned, have they not? uh,
It's like so bad now because it's been gorgeous and sunny, but we've had a little bit of a cold snap plus wind. So it looks like a summer day out my window, but as soon as you go outside, you find out really quickly it's not. So I don't know what the weather wants to do here. And it gets interesting, which I think we shared in a previous podcast, that it's cherry blossom season here in the DC area. And so we don't want too much of a cold snap because then that affects the livelihood of the cherry blossom trees and how long they will be in bloom for people to come and be tourists and take pictures and photographers doing their annual thing. So we don't want it to go too extreme from one direction to the other, but it has been cold. I mean, I had the electric blanket on, the big fuzzy socks. I'm like, what month is it? Really, really. But nothing like
mhm.
y'all's snow. I'm not going to complain
No.
too much.
No, and cold for Shauna is like 45 degrees. We're not talking like 25 here.
Exactly. Exactly. That's right. Well, look, Lisa, we have just a quick update because we have talked extensively about the Crown Act and specifically how it's being interpreted, reinterpreted, misinterpreted in various states. And I can't say that I'm surprised that the Crown Act failed in West Virginia. Okay. And so,
Mm-hmm.
given that, I can't say I'm surprised. I learned about this through Black Enterprise magazine, where the goal is to prohibit the discrimination of certain hairstyles, textures, and those hairstyles and textures are usually associated with a particular race. We know which one, African Americans. Um, and so I think what's interesting is that, you know, the bill was sent to the Senate Finance Committee to stall it and stall it and stall it, argued that this would be too costly when it comes to the possibility of lawsuits. And so, Human Rights Commission has already said that's not true. No, folks are not going. I mean, people can sue all they want, but it's not going to be any more cost prohibitive than it already would have been anyway, in regards to people that choose to push to that level. But, the folks that we're talking about here, you have to be careful with agency because how much agency would those individuals actually have if they're trying to get employment? Would they be able to just go to court whenever they feel like it? Because court does cost money. Come on, man. That's a ridiculous claim in my opinion. So I'm not surprised, disappointed as usual, but that's where we are in West Virginia. So Lisa, I think we should probably continue doing these state updates. I know people think that we're saying the same thing in several different ways, but every state will be different as this continues to roll out, right?
Yeah, yeah. You know, the one thing before we move on to the main segment here is I thought it
Yeah.
was so funny that the guy, the white guy, obviously was like, it's going to cost too much. And I'm like, is that basically an admission that you know there's like a shit ton of hair discrimination going on in your state and so you don't want to open
Hello.
the floodgates, right? I was like, I feel
Hello.
like that's what you're telling me right there with that statement.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Right. He showed his hand a little bit on that one for sure. Exactly.
Mhm,
So,
mhm.
at this point, at the time of this recording, there are 23 states that have enacted the Crown Act, 21 states that have been introduced a bill, but then there's 6 states that have no bills at all. So this is going to be interesting. We'll keep following as things roll along. And similar to the conversation we had before around, what happens in schools specifically and already marginalized kids in K through 12 and their hair. This is going to be really interesting. So I'm going to continue to follow. But it's never lost on me when I go see my wonderful barber that I don't have to think about it. And that is a distinct privilege of not working for someone anymore other than myself and not having to work about it, to worry about it in a work setting. So a privilege that I'm aware of and haven't always had, let me put it that way. So, but
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
let's get into phase one. Phase one. Now, I think it's so interesting because I've followed his career for many years. Emmitt Smith went to University of Florida. And so, of course, he has a vested interest in naming some of the DEI challengers in Florida. And so he went public over the last couple of weeks stating that, look, athletes, pay attention. If you are a non-white athlete, you might want to reconsider where you go, reconsider what state is open and friendly to DEI, because if it's an anti-DEI state, how do you expect them to treat you, right? And I appreciated Emmitt Smith coming forward and saying that as, a retired NFL athlete. I think it's important to name that he's been through that journey specifically in Florida. And so now we have the NAACP lodging a statement saying that, hey, if you're a Black student, and specifically if you're a Black student athlete, do not attend colleges in Florida given these laws that are prohibiting DEI work that actually specifically supports those very same students. And so they're not wrong. They're not wrong. And I always couch this in a little bit of proximity, Lisa. When I think about this, I've had this conversation about my boys with the family, with their dad. If it continues to happen where there are anti-DEI bills in certain states, and Trey is knocking on the door, he's 13 now. Once they get to college age, I am not willing to consider schools in states where there are anti-DEI anything there. And part of that is because we're already going to have that restriction. We're going to have that restriction of what supports can be provided, special programs that can be provided, anything that can bridge the gap between where Black men specifically are in higher ed versus everyone else. This to me is very challenging. So I can't say that I disagree with Emmitt. I completely agree. And then add on top of that all the anti-LGBT bills that are going on around the country as well, anti-trans specific. I just think it's something we need to be cognizant of, and I don't feel that the NAACP is off the mark. I don't feel like they're inflating the issue. I think they're being very clear. When I read it, Lisa, it almost reminded me of travel advisories. When you're about to travel abroad, and they're like, "Look, we're just letting you know,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
beware," right? And so it
Mm-hmm.
reminded me of that, but I can't say I disagree, Lisa.
No, and I think it speaks to this larger issue around where do we have power? And I think a lot of that resides in the power of the purse, right? So where are we choosing to invest our dollars? And oftentimes we might think about that as, a, a company that has said, homophobic comments or racist comments, so we're not going to buy that product anymore. But it's bigger than that, right? It is, in this case, where are you going to invest money in higher education? And of course, some students and student athletes in particular might get scholarships to go to those Florida institutions, but they're still going to be spending money in the state, right? So money is still going to be spent on housing and other activities, social life, that sort of thing. So it's not that they're not going to be contributing to that state's economy. And I do think that we all have a vested interest in really considering, all right, I really don't love how Florida is, banning books, reducing the curriculum, inhibiting how we can talk about the history of enslavement in this country. And now, obviously, we have essentially stripped the capacity for organizations, higher ed in particular, to have DEI offices. Well, I'm not going to vacation in Florida, right? I am not going to go there because I am not going to
That's
spend
right.
that kind of money. And I think that that's an important conversation that you have to have with yourself if you don't live there, right? Like, what are the steps that you can take? And I'm thinking back to North Carolina. It was 2016, I think. There was a bill, HB2, called the Bathroom Bill. You may remember it. It passed, and it essentially prevented folks from using the bathroom that matched their gender identity. And obviously, we have come a long way since then in terms of the number of LGBT and transphobic specific bills that we're seeing. But back then, that bill passed, and there was a massive backlash. And part of the backlash were a number of companies. I even think there was like a big sporting event that was supposed to happen there, and they didn't host it there. Like it might have been like the All-Star game for the baseball, something like that, and
Yeah,
they
yeah,
moved it to another state, and there was such a financial impact on North Carolina. The year later, they repealed the bill, right? And so that's an example of how where you put your money as an individual and as a corporation can matter, right? It can change the course
yeah.
of these regressive policies that we're seeing. So you've got both the advisement from the NAACP for, the health and well-being of Black students, but then there's also that larger issue of let's just stop putting money into Florida, right?
Right, right, exactly. Well, and, that's what gets interesting. We talked about Greek life here on this podcast, and that's what's been getting interesting too. I've been noticing for Black Greek fraternities and sororities that have their major national uh, conferences each year, which we call them boulets, we call them conclaves. They're called a lot of different names, but thousands of people attend these events. Contracts are put in place years in advance of any legislation being actually filed. And so when people start thinking about, oh, well, we have our conclave, our boulot in 6 months, and because we don't agree with XYZ happening in this state, we're willing to pull. And not only are we willing to pull our contract, we're willing to pay whatever separation fee to break the contract. And what does that say for entire organizations? I think it's really important, and it's something to consider because, we have this, very personal family situation where, Trey had the opportunity next week, which is spring break here for students. He had the opportunity to do a fantastic track meet over spring break. Let me tell you, the millisecond we found out that it was in, I want to say it was in Tampa, doesn't matter. It was in the state of Florida. Guess who's not going? Fortunately, they didn't even have his event, so it wasn't even a decision we had to make once we found out that they did not have field events. But if they
Okay.
did,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
no,
Yeah.
thank you. No, thank you.
Yeah.
And now that's not to say that we aren't nuanced and aware. So, for example, let's say there's a situation where I am going to uh, support a client that we have on contract. Well, if I have to go to these anti-DEI states, then I can put on my thinking cap and find, for example, a Black owned business, an LGBT run business, what have you, in order to support them if there are narrow choices. But I'd prefer not to be there at all. And so it's not as easy as completely divesting from the state because there are still Black and brown people there that are trying to run their businesses and live their life that cannot just up and move to a pro DEI state. But if we're not even having the conversation, if no one's making a statement on it, then it's very easy to think that your silence is complicit there.
Yeah.
So I think we
Yeah.
need to name it as each state rolls along, especially when we need to go certain places.
Yeah, and money talks, right? We always
Absolutely.
talk about capitalism and how problematic that system is, and it that's the system we have, right? So
Right.
when we want to force the hand of a state government to ponder the error of their ways, right? When we're thinking
Hmm.
about social justice, we're thinking about anti-racism, then that is one of the levers. It's the most powerful lever. But your point is important that if you do have to go to Florida for whatever reason, right, then where do you invest your money when you're there? Right?
Yeah.
Like be
Yeah.
really intentional about that. But that, and if you are an organization that is thinking about hosting an event in 2 years and Orlando is on your list, right?
Yes.
Take it off
Yes.
your list, right?
Yes.
Don't sign
Yes.
that contract now because maybe things will be different in 2 years, but maybe not, right? Like,
Exactly.
and that they're going to start to notice that. And then internally, there's going to be pressure that gets applied. right?
Absolutely.
It's not going to happen
Absolutely.
overnight, but it has to be. There's ways to pull on that lever. I think that capitalist
Mhm.
lever.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Pull on that
Mm-hmm.
lever and, thinking too about, again, deeper systems thinking, because Lisa, you and I have worked with an organization that I would consider a social justice, social impact organization that was a global organization that was housed in the state of Florida. And they had to make some really hard decisions because there were some calls to say, hey, you should uproot and go to a more pro DEI, pro group state. And that would have been very interesting because think about a social justice organization that serves 300, 350, 400 other centers around the globe. And because their state is anti DEI, there are calls for them to move. But yet, if they move to another state that happens to be pro DEI, but less less helpful when it comes to business taxes in another state, you could be a social justice organization in Florida that's serving 350, 400 organizations, or pro DEI in another state where you can only afford to serve 100 centers under your umbrella because of the tax code there for the state. So these are not simple answers to these tough questions, but if you're not thinking critically about them, you will never grapple with the challenges of it. So we just need to think about the messiness of it and make decisions with our money that align with what our values are. If not, the silence is collusion, y'all. People will think because we're quiet and we don't say anything
Yeah.
that it's not an
Yeah.
issue. And it is
Yeah.
an issue. I think it will always be an issue, especially when we don't
Right.
speak.
Right.
Yeah. Well, look,
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, I
Mm-hmm.
think phase
Yeah.
3 is an interesting one. I'm sorry, phase 2 is an interesting one because I'm in the throes of working with an organization, um, and it's a new topic for them, but I don't think it's a new topic broadly. Dr. Lisa, how well versed are you when it comes to neuro-inclusive workplaces? I'm getting there.
Well,
I'm not. I'm
yeah.
not a
No.
know-it-all at all.
No, not as educated as I should be, but certainly on that learning curve. So I
Yeah.
hear you have knowledge to share. So I would respectfully request that you share said knowledge with us.
Look, look, I am no expert in that area. I'm just simply gathering expertise in this area. I was pleasantly surprised when an organization reached out saying that they were laying the groundwork on DEI efforts in their organization for several years now. But now, because of their field, which happens to be STEM fields, they are very curious, and managers and supervisors want training on how to build neuro-inclusive workplaces. And I thought that was so wonderful because neurodiversity often gets kind of left over in the wayside. I mean, it doesn't end up being
Yeah,
a regular conversation, do you think, Lisa, when
right.
it comes to DEI
Oh no,
broadly?
it's always forgotten. Always forgotten.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you have that broader omission, the broader omission of not training supervisors or managers at all to be supervisors and managers. That's number one. Then you have another layer of training managers and supervisors using an inclusivity lens to their work. And then you have the specific area of neurodiversity, which I thought was really cool. And so this is what I'm learning, Lisa, and we're going to just keep building on what I'm learning so far. There's a really great report that's been published, at least for the last couple of years, by City and Guilds Foundation, and it's called the Neurodiversity Index. And we can drop the link into the show notes so people can take a look at it because it's awesome. And it gets into the data points around this particular aspect of the workplace, why it's important, what people are doing to build more neurodiverse workforces. So 65.6 million members of the workforce would be considered neurodiverse or neurodivergent. Excuse me. See, I'm still learning language, y'all. Neurodivergent. And so 1 out of 5 folks in your workplace happens to be a neurodivergent individual. 1 out of 5 based on their numbers. Now, what really got me, and the the thing that validated even building out this training and sharing it with their supervisors and managers, only 28% of managers had any training at all related to neurodiversity in the last year. And so that tells us that it's needed, people need it. I think one of the things that you and I, Lisa, have talked about quite a bit over the last few years working with very large clients is around the caregiver lens of DEI and how it overlaps and connects in other ways. And a large portion of the report talks about, yes, you may be neurodivergent and you may be or not, and you're still being a caretaker to someone who is neurodivergent at the very same time. And so that's when my mind started exploding. And look, a 90-minute training is not going to cover all that, Lisa, but I'm just, it's an important conversation to have. And I'm working on the practical pieces of how to do that well, because it connects back to our many conversations, Lisa, on a universally designed workplace. It connects to all that.
Right. Right. Yeah, and we've talked about universal design before, and I think it comes from the education field conceptually, but it's broadly applicable, I think. And I'm even thinking back to some work I've done with organizations around their hiring process, right? And the way they have testing within that hiring process, or I don't agree with this at all, but some have like psychological testing and things like
Yeah,
personality testing,
yeah.
right? And or
Mhm.
like multiple rounds of interviews or day long interviews and presentations and this and that, and it's all kind of oriented around a particular way of being in the world, not recognizing that that might actually very much disadvantage a neurodivergent person or a person who kind of interacts differently than what you might be considering quote unquote normal, right? Um,
Yes.
and it's just absent, like,
Mhm.
so this person doesn't communicate very well, right? Well, are they
Mhm.
not communicating very well, or are they just communicating differently to what you're used to and your peer group does,
That's it.
right? Like, that's
That's
not
it.
necessarily a place for value judgment, right? About whether it's good, bad. It's
That's
just
right.
different. And so,
That's
how do
right.
you then adapt your workplace or your hiring process to accommodate or recognize that the people are different? Um, and so
Mm.
that's part of the universal design, right? How do you design a system, a process, a place that provides equal opportunity to thrive no matter how you learn, how you communicate, how you interact, right? That sort of thing.
Yes. Absolutely. And, now when we're talking about neurodiversity, for those that are first hearing this language in particular, we're talking about a number of different things. Unfortunately, neurodiversity has usually those that aren't talking broadly about it. It's kind of like, Lisa, when we talk about DEI and people immediately think we're only talking about race and gender, that type of thing. And so when it comes
Yep,
to
yep.
neurodiversity, people usually think the only thing we're talking about is autism, for example. That's
Right.
one of many. So we may be talking about autism spectrum, we may be talking about dyslexia, forms of trauma, even
Mm-hmm.
specific learning disorders, ADHD, anxiety, depression, OCD. There's a number of different things under that larger umbrella. And so, given that we're talking about all the different ways in which the brain works, and unfortunately, we've continued to create workplaces that only work for certain brains and not all of those brains. And so,
Right,
what I
right.
think is really interesting is when I started looking and researching some of the best practices. So, Lisa, you will completely understand this from a universal design perspective. So, let's say you're like my son who is ADHD and he really needs granular, specific steps, right? So, this is how you clean your room, Trey. So, I want you to first get all the dirty laundry, take it to the laundry room, pick up all the trash, take the sheets off your bed. Like everything needs to be in a specific order for him to understand it and do it well. Well, if you're in a deficit mindset as a supervisor, you would say, okay, this is really laborious. I do not want to sit down and make this very detailed list. This is extra work for this one person, right? That's the deficit model of looking at that. The
Mm-hmm.
asset based model of that is Fantastic. As a supervisor, I get to create a standard operating procedure of these are the steps in order to do this well that benefits everybody. So it benefits my son that has ADHD, but it also benefits someone that might be new on the job and has not learned how we do things yet, or someone who's been here for years and they're going back for a refresher training, an employee handbook, a manual, etc. And so, how do we think about this universal design in such a way that it's not, oh, woe is me, this is such a burden, but actually, this is beneficial for everyone. And let's do it because
Yeah.
it's beneficial to everyone, not because it's a special thing that I'm doing for someone. And so,
Hmm.
giving them some really concrete examples of that.
Yeah, I'm having an aha moment because I'm thinking about how, in an employment context, employees are often critiqued for not having initiative, right? Like, I gave you a task and you didn't do it, or you didn't do it how I
Right.
wanted you to do it, or like, you didn't kind of explore the possibilities. And I think in some cases it is just a lack of initiative, right? But in other cases, it could well be what you're describing, right? That based on how that person's brain works, is that there is a need for a more structured, stepped process for them to be able to produce the result that you're looking for. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
not, so the deficit model would be this person's incompetent, they have no initiative, right?
Absolutely.
Like, I can't rely on them to get stuff done. I give them, I tell them what I want them to do, and then they don't do it, or they do something completely different. Yeah, and
Exactly.
so we are set up. We have set everything up to value that, right? When
That's
like, to not, providing guidance or step by step is considered babying, and you shouldn't
right.
need to do that as an
Coddling.
adult in the workplace, right?
Mhm.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
When actually it's a really big part of expectation setting, right? So, if I tell Trey clean up your room and he takes everything and throws it in the closet and now the room is clean, that's his version of clean versus
yeah, yeah,
stepwise process of now I know
right.
this is teenagery, so this might be like, 70% ADHD and 30% teenagery, but you get my point that
Yeah,
that definition of clean and my expectation as a mom supervisor is completely different. And so if we don't get
yeah.
clear on what it is, then we're setting folks up for failure. And that includes everybody. Because what if you're that
Hmm.
one person that is, really good at their job? You may be neurotypical. And so let's say there's 10 steps to a process and you got 9 out of the 10, but the one that you didn't get is also very important, both and so it's still beneficial to everyone involved. And so, I think I had to be careful, Lisa, not getting carried away with building this training out, because a lot of it actually happened before the person was even on the job, to your point, around the interview process. Like, think about how the interview process usually values how social someone is, how they quote unquote fit in, how they pick up on social cues. That may not be the neurodivergent person at all, but they may be, you know, the next Nobel winner in a STEM field, but they don't feel like talking to you, or they don't pick up
Right,
on those social cues. We've
right.
crafted a process of even search and hire that weeds out people that are more qualified but less uh socially normal, socially typical. I don't want to say normal, maybe typical is
Yeah,
the right
yeah, it's
word. I'm
typical,
not sure yet.
socially typical, right?
Socially
Yeah,
typical. Yeah.
beyond introverted, extroverted, but being
Oh,
able
yes.
to engage with someone in kind of a typical, what we would consider a typical way, which is itself problematic, right? When we think about like how we've even, so typical, I think, is better than normal, like neurotypical versus
Exactly. Yes,
normal,
yes,
but it's
yes.
still kind of operating on this, like, the majority of people are X, when perhaps that's not even true, right?
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly. And based on these numbers, that's not the case at all.
right,
1 out of 5
right.
is a very large number.
Yeah. Yeah. And then even job descriptions, I'm just, yeah, this is just, like, you see like self-starter, motivated, must demonstrate initiative, team player, but works well on their own, right? Like, which actually seems quite contradictory because people tend to have
Exactly.
skills in different places. And you're like, well, that doesn't really fit There's not a lot of people, not many people's brains are going to fit all of those things, right? Yet that's
Right.
the litany of things you have to prove in a job interview that might also be structured in a way that does not benefit you. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And they even talked about something as simple as eye contact, which I know has multiple layers because in some cultures, lack of eye contact is meant to be respectful, and other cultures interpret it as disrespectful. But it talks specifically about neurodivergent folks that do not have eye contact. It can be seen as not fitting into that social typical model of interviewing. Or, for example, uh, questions in the interview process, right? So, as I started to do more work with more equitable, anti-biased hiring practices, it became the norm to write the questions out, give them to
Right.
the person in writing,
Yep.
have them in a specific order, that type of thing. That's beneficial to a lot of people, but to
Mm-hmm.
a neurodivergent individual, having those questions earlier for more processing time is not an advantage. It's simply a
Right.
different way of processing. But
Yeah.
it's the deficit model is that, oh, well, it's not fair for Lisa, who is
Yep.
neurodivergent, to have da 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 a day before Shaunna. Actually, that levels the playing field
It
because Shaunna
levels.
did a day
Yes.
before, but Lisa does, so let's do it.
Yep.
Right. And so I think I think it's going to be less about the best practices and more about the mindset shift of the
Yeah.
deficit model versus the asset model when it comes to this training I'm
Agree.
trying to build out here.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, this is so fascinating. So, as you continue to build the training and learn more, you need to circle back with me and our
Yeah,
listeners to continue to educate us on this um, really important topic. So,
absolutely.
my little popcorn brain is going a mile a minute right now. So, uh, for fear of going down too many rabbit holes on this phase, let's move on to phase three, which for our last pod of Women's History Month is about sexism. So
Oh,
we
joy.
couldn't, yeah, we couldn't not talk about it. So many of you may have seen floating around the interwebs was video clips and various memes of a hearing that was held recently at the Minnesota State Senate. Um, and one of the senators there, a man named Gene Dornink, asked someone who was testifying a pretty interesting question. So the woman who was testifying, Laura Haynor, introduced herself as a first officer for Delta, so a pilot for Delta, and also introduced herself as being there to represent the Airline Pilots Association International. So this is already out there, right? They know
Uh,
that this group is being represented. Laura has
oh,
introduced herself as a pilot for Delta. And then shortly thereafter, Gene, Senator Gene, says, "Can you tell me what a typical work week looks like as a stewardess?"
as a
So,
stewardess. Mm-mm.
yes. So, um, all the memes are like, representing the expression that she had on her face, but she basically corrects him and says, "Well, actually, I'm a pilot." And then he kind of pauses, realizes his error, and then is like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I don't know why I said that. I'm really sorry." Right? And all the women are screaming at these memes and videos, being like, "We know why you said this. You said this
Hello?
because sexism has trained you to believe that women are only in service industries and they can't possibly be pilots. So you didn't listen to her saying that she was a pilot. You paid no attention to the fact that this was testimony from a pilots association,
That's the funny
right?
part for me. Right, right, right.
Yeah, and you made a big old sexist assumption, like that connection was made for him in the blink of an eye or like in a millisecond, right? In the same way that
Yes.
you just, you drive from home to work and you kind of don't think about it. You don't
Right.
remember doing it. That's what happened because it's so ingrained that he didn't even give it, like, it happened, right? I think that's what happened. I don't think that he was maliciously doing it, but I think there is some
Hmm.
dispute around that. But oh my god, it made me so angry.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and if you think about it, Lisa, to your point, because that's literally how quick bias happens. Anybody that's listening to this podcast right now, if you blink or if you snap your fingers, bias happens in less than half of a second. especially when it comes to gender. And so, given that, what I think is so interesting about this whole thing is intentional or unintentional. This gentleman, I don't know how old he is, but obviously he's a grown ass man. Decades of conditioning that a pilot is only one gender. Decades of conditioning. And that goes for all of us when it comes to particular areas. Decades of, like, think about, I listen, and I'm always trying to reprogram my own brain, but listen to people when they're speaking. Like, how many times does someone say, Lisa says to me, hey, yeah, I had a doctor's appointment today. And me being a concerned friend saying, yeah, well, what did he say? Well,
Yeah.
Lisa never
Yep.
told me it was a man.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa didn't tell me anything. And so, but again, how quickly it's ingrained, and then
Mm-hmm.
actually it's she. I've done it before to my sons, where my son might use a particular name for a friend that I've never met before. Okay, well, how is she doing? Well, it may not be she. And so it happens to us all the time based
Right.
on conditioning. But this one was so interesting because it was very clear who she was testifying for and in what role. Would a stewardess be? I even think stewardess is dated language, but whatever.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
A stewardess be testifying on behalf of pilots? Probably not, thinking people. It was just ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I don't
Yeah,
think
it's
for it, but here we are.
yeah, I mean, a friend of mine years ago for Halloween came to work in Scrubs as a doctor, and several people in her department was like, "Oh, you came as a nurse, right?" So it's like the same thing, and she posted on Facebook about it, and then got and a nurse kind of defensively responded like, "Well, there's nothing wrong with nursing." Well, the point of her post wasn't that there's anything wrong with nursing. It was that she came as a doctor, and people assumed because she was a woman, she was a nurse, not a doctor. So it's
That's
not that being a nurse is less than being a doctor. It's the
it's
gendered assumption
inaccurate.
that gets made. Yes.
It's
Yeah.
an inaccurate gender assumption. I mean,
Yeah.
one posted, I can't remember what friend of mine posted on social media, something about being misconstrued based on gender. And I gave the greatest example that I lived in my life was, whenever this was when I was married, the assumption was always that Dr. Gold was him, not me. Now he's Esquire, and that's
Yeah.
great, but
Yeah.
it was never the assumption that the wife was Dr. Gold, or like when you address something, like, let's say you're addressing something to an invitation to a wedding or something like that. It was always Dr. and Mrs. Gold, not Dr. and Esquire. It was never, it was very rarely that. I think it happened maybe once where it was accurate, but it's just not accurate. So if someone asked Lisa to introduce herself, should I address you as Miss, Mrs., Mrs., and she says, I'm doctor, thank you. That's no knock on anyone that chooses other honorifics or titles, but it's just simply not accurate for her, and it's no knock on anyone else. Now we can talk about the whole system of Mr. and Mr. versus Ms. We got that. We understand that rabbit trail. But it's just flat out inaccurate based on gender.
Yeah. Yeah. Those biases are you're so right, like decades entrenched, like absolutely entrenched, right? And I've done the assumption around he. I mean, I have family members that always assume he. I mean, they assume he for
Yeah.
dogs, they assume he for doctors, they assume he for friends. Like he is just the first pronoun that comes out in relation to anything where it is not clear the pronoun to be used, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's never the other way around. Like I look for it in news articles, right? When like news, like journalists are writing about a made up professional, and if it's a doctor or a lawyer or a judge or a pilot, right? I look to see whether the journalist uses he or she pronouns. I see like, and I if the journalist alternates and starts with a she and then is a he and then gives another example and it's moves around, I they get brownie points from me for that. But if they're talking, they only use he in these imaginary examples throughout their piece, then I stop reading. So yeah, because it's in
Yes.
there. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. No, you're reminding me of this. riddle that one of my uh, professors, this wasn't even in high school, this was in college, where the professor read this riddle. And I mean, it took us like 30 minutes to figure this thing out, which tells us how entrenched we think, right? So God forbid, the riddle is a man and a son get into a car accident and they're rushed off to the hospital. The son requires surgery, and the surgeon looks at the boy and says, I can't perform surgery on him. And we're all sitting there trying to figure out why. Well, because the surgeon was mom.
Yeah.
Well, back then, people were like, well, I don't understand. Well, what happened with, assuming that a doctor, a surgeon
Mm-hmm.
probably was not a woman. Are you serious? Like now we may think quite differently, but if I talk to my medical professional friends, a lot of them are Black female doctors. They will tell you that they stopped counting how many times they were assumed to be the nurse, or the patient said, could you please call the
Yeah.
doctor in? And they are already there. Those types of things happen countless moments in their life. And
Mm-hmm.
so I appreciate that this guy at least apologized, like, in
Yeah.
person, and said, I'm sorry. I don't know. I appreciate that, because oftentimes we don't even get that. We don't even get the
No.
apology.
No.
But the aviation world has a ways to go. I mean, from what I understand, there's less than 6% of women pilots worldwide. Um, and yet we've had some things that have happened to commemorate that and bring attention to that. Lisa, you sent me a great picture of all woman crew with, I believe it was two Black women pilots,
Yep.
co-pilots,
Yep.
which was incredible. I remembered back in 2022, it was an all Black United crew that flew in honor of Bessie Coleman, who is the first Black woman to get her pilot's license. So, they're making it very clear what's going on, but this little incident is just a microcosm of the larger problem.
Yeah.
Microcosm.
The thing that that recent thing I sent you, a United flight, I think it was from
Hmm.
New York maybe to Florida or something. Back to don't be flying to Florida. But
Right, right, right.
they made a huge it was an all-woman crew, and then the two pilots were both Black women, and it was a huge thing, right? Like they announced it, they celebrated it, people got
Yeah.
interviewed about it. Like, because it doesn't happen, right? Like, so can
Right.
you imagine being at a time where that's just normal, right? And we aren't, doing a marching band at the fact that we have an all woman crew, and in particular two women pilots. I mean, I recently flew on a Southwest flight, and it was in December when I went for my marathon to California, and it was a woman pilot, and she was funny.
Okay.
Not that she shouldn't be funny, but she like came on and like talked to us, and so but I and it was because of her gender identity, right?
Yeah.
Like that was part of why she engaged. Like, I don't see men pilots doing that very often, right? So again, it was like called out, and it was because
Yeah.
it's so rare.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and to your great point, I'm just thinking about all the people that are, you know, they are not very good flyers, that they are really very frightened, and to have anything that's comforting would be great. I mean, I think all of us at some point, even if you aren't afraid of flying, you still want to know, is everything good up there, y'all? So, anything that happens, but I think that cognizance is really cool. And, I think once again, that can be an asset. It's another, I don't know if soft skill is the best word, because I'm still toying with how I feel about the word soft skill, but professionally, those types of soft skills are to benefit. And so why not have them? And when we see women that do, why not put them in more places and spaces where they should be?
Yeah. So on that note of indignation about the Minnesota senator and the lack of women in the field of aviation, let's wrap it up and finish for this week. So, um, how can folks find us, Shaunna?
Look, we're gonna find us a all woman crew, and we're gonna fly somewhere
Yep.
away from anti DEI states towards pro
Yes.
DEI states. That's where we're going, Lisa. That's where we're going.
Yep.
Where
Yep.
y'all can find us. But no, for real, if you want to find us, please make sure that you go to our YouTube channel, Unfazed, the un in brackets, Unfazed, Unedited. You can find us there. You can find us on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Of course, we're on Instagram, LinkedIn. And of course, if you have things that you see that are interesting, as you all can hear, Lisa and I are on all different platforms sending each other things that we want to talk about here on the podcast. You can email us things that you would like for us to address here. info@unfazedpodcast.com. Go to our website, unfazedpodcast.com, where you get all of the archives, as well as our new shows. And of course, share. Please share this with friends, coworkers, family members, loved ones, anyone that's in this phase of your life. So until next week.
See you next week, folks.